Hello everyone, my name is Wana and welcome to Culture Diaries. Today on the show, my guest is the founder of the Lagos International Poetry Festival. He is one of Nigeria's most electrifying poets on both stage and page, and he just happens to be a very dear friend of mine. He goes by the name Efe Paul Azino. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Wana.
Drum roll. Efe, page and the stage. I feel like we're never going to get tired of this conversation. Let's have it
And
out.
hopefully we are not going to have it.
Let's have it out in the open now. I want to have it. This page and the stage, you know, people are seen as more intellectual on the page or more serious or taking it more seriously. There's still the criticism that goes with spoken word poets on the stage as well. I mean, we both write for the page and the stage. I mean, what's your take on the whole thing?
I think poetry is poetry. And it's like a false dichotomy in some sense because, you know, before the page, there was poetry. You know, poetry did not come with the page, as it were. Some of the classics we read today, from Homer's The Iliad, the Odyssey, the Canterbury Tales, I mean, these works came to us in oral form. These were works that were, you know, great works, epic works of poetry, you know, that were basically performed. You know, we can actually even make a case that it was spoken word poetry in a sense because it was poetry performed, you know, for the ear and for an audience. But then you had the advent of the page. But poetry on the page assumed its own aesthetics and became, I think it's about distribution in a sense. At that time, you couldn't, I mean, if you perform poetry for an audience, it stays with that audience. You know, probably there was no digital means of recording and archiving, you know, material in the oral form.
It's done,
exactly,
it's done,
you know.
yeah.
But with the page, you could distribute. So it almost became like the official vehicle for poetry. But that became poetry. That became defined as poetry. You know, but you see, you had, the oral form has always been there. Even when poetry made the transition to the page, you still had oral poetry. You know, but now, you can archive poetry in its oral form in the same way you can archive poetry on the page. And to a very large extent, if you hear a good performance piece, if you hear a good poem that we can classify as spoken word poem, if it sits on the page, it's going to have exactly the same feel, if it's a good poem. That's my own personal opinion. So I think a good poem will be effective on the stage, and a good poem will be effective on the page as well.
So we can finally kill that conversation, right?
Well,
Or are you tired of having this?
I'm actually tired of having it, you know.
I just have to punish you a little bit.
You know, and I think what also happens is that people compare the best of page poetry to the worst of spoken word poetry. And the thing with spoken word poetry is the barrier of entry is very low, you know. So you have people who, you know, who don't even read poetry, you know, as long as you can rhyme a few words together, it can pass as spoken word poetry. You know, so because of that, you have many people, you know, who come out and say they're poets, and you know, and it tilts more towards spoken word because it's easier, you know, to stand in front of a stage. I mean, you even have people who freestyle poetry, you know. But I think the more you mature, you begin to take a more liberal view to these things. You know, and realize that, I mean, every form of expression is valid. If it has an audience that appreciates it, you know, that considers it poetry, you have an audience it speaks to, yeah, then maybe it's poetry.
Let's talk about the sort of evolution of poetry now. I mean, poetry, spoken word, whatever people like to call it, it's seen its renaissance within the past, 10, 15 years
Yes.
or so? And with the internet, you know, Instagram, Twitter, this bite-sized poetry, there's also a different revolution that's happening there in that world as well.
Yes.
I remember, you know, just going on YouTube and watching a vlog, and she said something like, for a very long time, it seemed like poetry was deliberately made to be incomprehensible. And so for the first time, with a lot of poets who've garnered a lot of following on the internet, it's become accessible, understandable. And there are people who sort of, you know, think that cheapens it in some way. I want to know your thoughts on that, because there's also a trend in that where everyone is sort of following in those footsteps too.
Robert Frost is the road less traveled, as simple as it comes. I mean, and I think the greatest poet for me of the 20th century was Pablo Neruda. I mean, completely accessible. You can read and understand exactly what he's saying. on the city to a very large extent. So I don't think making poetry accessible cheapens it in any way. There are people who feel like, poetry is some sort of scripture. So it has to come with codes and, when you are able to unravel the mystery,
A lot of
then
deciphering going on.
you do a lot of deciphering for you to unearth one nugget of wisdom and your life is completely transformed. So maybe that also has its place, but some of the finest poems we've seen, in recent times have been poems that, and there are poems that exist exactly, as powerful on the page and as powerful on the stage. Lately there's been Western Shire's home poem,
yes.
Against the backdrop of the whole refugee crisis. Very simple poem, but absolutely powerful, and speaks to not just history, but to the now. And so, yes, I think making it simple and plain, simple in quotes, doesn't cheapen it in any way.
Let's go to you as a poet and being sort of labeled as a political poet. Do you have any issues with that labeling, or you're very okay with it?
It's a bit of both. My natural instinct is to rebel against it, to try to discard it, but it served its purpose actually, practically.
I sense a tinge of something in your voice there. Express yourself, please.
I think first of all, it's important that for me it comes from an honest place. I think you have to write based on what you feel. If you feel angry about the political system and you feel powerless and you feel like the only way you can respond to it is via poetry, and you do it well, I think it's actually very important we have, poetry speaking to the issues of today. We can make an argument that that's the whole purpose of poetry. We can make a counter-argument that is not, and both arguments will be valid to some extent. But for the past 10 years or thereabouts, I made a conscious decision to speak to the issues as I saw them, because I felt like it was the only way I could respond to Nigeria's continued attempts to kill me. But you do that over time, and you become disillusioned really quick to some extent, in the sense that you begin to question the impact it actually has, in terms of concrete change. Is it able to change policy? Is it able to change the way? Is it able to challenge the thinking, of everyday people who come in contact with it? Is it able to speak truth to power? Do they listen? You have these questions that bug you. But I think it's important to believe that it does make a difference. It's important to believe that, someone said, poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. That's a bit of a stretch, but it's just important to feel that it makes a difference. And so if I feel the need, now to write, I have a new collection coming out, Ode to Laughter. It's completely personal, basically documents, my emotional transition, in some sense. And it's as revolutionary as well, as they say, the personal is also political. So I'm making a transition. Maybe not, maybe that's the wrong way to put it. But I'm writing I'm writing on the more softer side of issues, as it were, at this stage in my career. And the solution I spoke about earlier on is also part of it, when you feel like all this anger, you're not changing anything, and you want to just do something different, something you feel strongly about at that point, because you are also going to through issues as a person, and you're trying to make sense of it, and poetry helps you do that.
Now, it's interesting you bring up the conversation about transitioning, and we talk about political poetry to this idea of tenderness and sharing personal poems. One of the observations is also that a lot of the contemporary young poets who are really sort of connecting a lot with people who are not even typical poetry lovers, a lot of them are women, and one of the themes a lot of them are exploring is vulnerability. And a lot, as I said, a lot of them are women. And I'm wondering what it is about male poets where they're not exploring as much vulnerability. And for you in particular, was there any reason you didn't? Because you explore intimate things in your poetry collection for Broken Men Who Cross Often.
Yeah.
But on the stage, like, people don't know you for any vulnerable poems. It's very much very charged politics, hard, maybe one or two love poems, which you do every now and again. And I want to know if there was any reason that you didn't do that earlier, or it was just about a thing of the time for you. And perhaps it's an age thing. And also, just commentary on men and vulnerability.
I think it's me growing, as a person and as a poet as well. Initially there was a lot of anger, with the system politically, and one had to channel, one's work in that direction. But as you grow, you go through stuff that you also want to give voice to, and some of them very, very conflicting, or some of them, reflections of this very, conflicted, personality, which I think in a sense, mirrors the average human experience and rings, true universally as a poet, which is also something I think, one wants to aim for, universality, in your works. Sometimes it occurs to you more when your poetry travels. You become a little bit concerned about, this is very contextual, this is locally contextualized. Some of the issues you're addressing are about Nigeria, and then you have to do, a poem in maybe Amsterdam, and you realize that, this particular poem may not travel well. Sometimes it does, because these are issues of social justice, and they are very universal as well. But your references tend to be very local, and, alienates your audience to a certain extent. And as you grow, you become more aware of that, and you want to explore, more universal themes, more not really softer themes per se, because love is anything but soft, But you just want to explore other themes, and I think that is what has happened, with me as a person and me as a poet, that sort of evolution. It's doubtful if a work of poetry, or even prose for that matter, can be really powerful and effective. It's not very vulnerable on some level. So I think every good work of poetry has some level of vulnerability. It may not necessarily be emotional.
Okay.
But
I was going to say perhaps it's about the level of how open the poet chooses to be, or how much vulnerability they choose to share.
They choose to share, exactly. And I think there's also the societal factor in terms of the way men are wired, not being very open, about what they go through. But then to be completely contrary to the experience and to the vocation of a poet, because a poet is supposed to mine that. That's supposed to be material.
But I think at the end of the day, being a poet doesn't extract you from the system that you're created in.
Yes, you're right.
It does take an extra level of sort of unearthing for you to be able to interrogate yourself.
And sometimes.
Yeah.
Now, this is very African in the sense that we inherited a tradition. We inherited the tradition of literature as protest, from the first generation of the Achebes and Soyinka. It was protest, against colonialism and its effects, and then for the poets that inherited that tradition from them, it was protest against the new, empire, the new colonizers, dictatorships and military regimes, and poets made their bones, from that kind of tradition of mixing activism, with art, So, and those are the people you learn from and you read, particularly, and it's largely male-dominated as well. Yeah. So, as a male poet coming up, you sort of think that, if I'm going to do poetry, then I have to, address some of these issues, and sometimes you feel like you need to. So, so tradition also, plays a role in that regard.
I remember reading an excerpt. I don't know whether it was. I think it was Tedrick Cole that said something about how, and I've asked a few artists this question as well. How it seems like once you're African, our work is belabored with an ism. Colonialism, post-colonialism, feminism, some identity politics. There's always some kind of racism, classism, sexism. There's always some kind of ism that's attached to it. Do you ever, as a poet, do you ever feel that way, especially when you're called on to perform, somewhere? Like, do you feel like there's an expectation of you, being the resistance force?
Yes, there is actually, and that's the truth. Yes, there is. Particularly when you have to do, readings, in the West, where everybody expects. I mean, it's an African poet is going to be angry. He's going to have dreads. He's going to be on dashikis. And is going to, raise up black power and all of that. So there's that expectation. And, but I think we have a lot of, writers and poets who are defying that, right now as we speak. You have the Tejikos, and the women are doing a fantastic job, of creating, alternative narratives. I think the women own the space as it is. The male poets are struggling. Wana, Udobang, all the doors are blocked. We're trying to find.
Thank you for the shameless plug.
We're trying to find a way through. So yes, there's that expectation. But I think for me, I'm bothered particularly with honesty. If I really feel angry and what I want to write is protest poetry, then I'm going to write protest poetry. And if it comes from an honest place, it's going to connect. I'm not going to write protest poetry because I think if I write protest poetry, then it's, gives me more attention and makes it easier for me to create a space for myself. If you do that, it's going to show in the work eventually at some point. So I think honesty is the most important thing for me. And the whole pushback against poverty porn, in literature, is becoming prescriptive in itself. So you have young writers who strongly want to address political issues, who also don't want to be labeled as, that
political writer.
That political writer. So I think we need to be a little bit more nuanced, in the way we approach, the issues.
I mean, you've been traveling a lot. You've done festivals, Berlin, South Africa, residencies, and all of these sorts of things. And looking around the world, lots of poets are doing very interesting and innovative things with poetry as well. You have the likes of Elams, creating theatre and different types of shows, whether it's physical theatre, whether it's one-man shows. Sometimes it feels like we're still on the just reciting poetry level. Do you think we're not advancing enough, or do you think that the space is not even mature enough yet? So what are your thoughts on that in terms of the innovation? Are we going fast enough?
I don't think we are moving, or we're not maturing fast enough. I think it's okay, given the context in which we have to do this. In terms of funding, in terms of infrastructure, that also plays a huge role, in terms of how much we are able to do with the little resources we have. So against that backdrop, I think we haven't done badly at all, and we're not doing badly at all, but there's still a lot more ground to cover. I think particularly with spoken word and with poetry, every art form gains mainstream appeal and acceptance, by the proliferation of quality performers. So if you have 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 quality poets, who are each creating, a diverse body of work that is speaking to the people, and you have that same representation across the country, eventually the art form, demands or gains, mainstream acceptance. So what I think we don't have enough is enough quality, poets and performers, who are actually doing stuff. There are people doing stuff, but not enough.
Mm. Let's talk about Lagos International Poetry Festival. I mean, what made you decide to start that? Because you move from artist to gatekeeper, and it can take a lot. It takes a lot of time, and it can take a lot of attention from your work as a poet as well.
Yes.
So, what made you start that, knowing all those things?
I mean, we didn't start it with that in mind, with how the impact is going to have on your own personal, creativity in mind. But we just wanted to do something. Wanted to do something.
It was very altruistic.
Yeah.
And
yeah. And I think it was an answer to the question of quality. This whole idea that we don't have enough people, who are doing this thing. We have a lot of people who are interested in doing it. We have a lot of people who are doing it regardless of how they think they sound or not. So we felt like, instead of complaining about quality, let's do a series of workshops. And let's throw in 1 or 2 panels. Let's throw in an evening of performance. You know what? Let's just do a festival, because we don't have in spite of the attention poetry is getting, in the country, it's still not, it's still almost like an appendage to other artistic productions. So there's a book festival, and let's just sprinkle it one or two poets, have a poet come and open for a film festival, have a poet come and open for a
We're always the
musical
we're always the
yeah.
appendage.
So I felt we needed to create poetry is important enough and needs to create, its own space, and that's what we wanted to do. And not just create a space for Nigerian poets or African poets, but a global space, because Lagos is a city, a global city, complex, contradictory on many levels, but we still can't, ignore the cultural force, that is Lagos on many levels, artistically and culturally. And I felt, it was important for us, for poetry to tap into that, because you have a huge Lagos poetry scene, but not just tap into it, but to create a global space where you have, poets from across the world, come to Lagos and experience the city, and basically share on poetry and writing and global issues, as they see them. I've always been interested in collaborative works, particularly across the continent, and that was also another driving force behind the festival, to create a space where we can have, because what you're doing here, what you're going through, as an artist in Nigeria, you have artists in Kenya, in Ghana, in South Africa, dealing with similar issues, as well, similar challenges, and, it's important that we talk to ourselves. So where the politicians have failed in terms of creating the infrastructure and policies that guarantee free movement and enables that sort of collaboration, we can succeed as artists, in being able to do that in spite of the borders. So that was the thinking behind the Lagos International Poetry Festival, and 2 years on, it's grown. It's been able to curate its own, become a force, a global force, for poetry and for culture. I'm very proud of that, I must say. So yes, we need more money. We need more sponsors. It's good for the brand. Yeah. So
What's been would I say, your observation of its own evolution and growth?
It's been very challenging, because Lagos does not automatically lend itself to festivals. It's a very busy city. You have traffic. You have to deal with a lot, infrastructure-wise. So Lagos itself was a challenge, and the biggest problem anyway, if there's money, you surmount every problem. So funding was also, and has also been a major issue. And we were going into this we hadn't done a festival before. We've done a few successful events here and there, but nothing on this scale. So it was also a learning curve.
Why is it still so difficult to get funding for, things like poetry, literature, even theater, anything that is not fashion or mainstream music?
It's capitalism, pure and simple. It's capitalism, and I think it's also the function of a society that doesn't place, the requisite value, on the intellectual, on the aesthetic, on the cultural, on the artistic, and no society can, evolve, without that. Koleka Putuma's water.
This is where I just enter pidgin. Oh boy. That poem is a killer.
Very, very bad.
I just every time I just go to YouTube, I just play it again. I'm like,
Very bad.
What's the meaning of this?
What's your problem?
I think it's one of those poems where you just the gods descended and just dropped it.
Tried to disgrace us. I'll say Wole Soyinka.
Okay.
I'll say Wole Soyinka. Still living, still an artist.
Okay.
Yeah, Wole Soyinka. Piece of fruit. Coconut. Hard on the exterior, but tender, sweet and tender inside.
Well, it's unripe. It's the ripe coconut that is tender, that is fleshy inside.
Okay, unripe coconut.
Once the thing is ripe, it's hard.
But it's sweet inside.
It's sweet, yes.
Restless. The president of Nigeria.
If can you handle it?
But at least I can make 1 or 2 calls to the CBN and move 1 or 2 things. I kid. Is there any song about life being complicated? Any complicated song?
Any complicated song?
Cut and paste. My biggest regret, not following my dreams earlier on.
That is actually quite a regular answer for a lot of people I've spoken to.
I think because it's true. To my younger self, read more. Read more. Read more. A lot more. And, cool down. Take it easy. It's not that serious. I think art can change the world. I think, the world would be completely dysfunctional without art, because we need art to not just reflect, not just interpret society, but to also help us shape it, to give us that sense of empathy, which I think it does very well, and to help us see how alternative futures, alternative realities, help us appreciate the complexity, of human existence, and there's a sense in which it trains us to be able to make, important decisions, and so I think in that sense, art can change the world. Art has changed the world and will continue to change the world. I cried.
Efe Paul Azino, thank you so much for
Thank you
coming
very
on
much,
Culture
WanaWana.
Diaries. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of the show. Big, massive thank you to Efe Paul Azino for coming into the Culture Diaries studio. Thank you also goes out to Sus Productions for giving us the beautiful studio. Then you will also find details at the bottom of the screen. Don't forget, guys,